Thank you for zooming in today to this evening's presentation of Cold War Long Island. With us today, we have the authors of Cold War Long Island, published by History Press. We have Christopher Verga and Karl Grossman, both authors and educators who have studied the history of Long Island and have been a part of the history of Long Island for quite a number of years. And I'd like to thank them for being able to.
I can't give them.
And if anyone has any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, or if you'd like to just unmute and ask the question, that's perfectly fine. And without further ado, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Christopher Verga and Karl Grossman.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Hope everyone's having an excellent week. Happy Sunday. Before we start, my name is Christopher Verga. I teach Long Island history at Suffolk Community College, and I got a few books on Long Island history. One of them is Saving Fire Island from Robert Moses, and the other one is on World War II, the Long Island home front. Karl and I did this book right here, Cold War, Long Island. Karl was the premier reporter during this era of the Cold War. So doing any project without him, especially Cold War, is impossible. Karl reported on about 90% of these stories that we're discussing tonight. So you're getting a primary source here. So please just jump in and ask any questions. Just feel free to unmute yourself. Karl and I are both educators, so we're open to all questions. So it's Cold War, History Press, and it came out in, Karl, when did this come out? October of 2000?
October 14th, actually.
October 14th, 2001, the last October. And it's available right now in Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and of course, History Press, Arcadia website as well. So let's just jump right into it. So when we discuss the Cold War is many contradictions, And it's anxiety anxiety and turmoil, but at the end of the day, it made modern day Long Island. So the Cold War, technically, you can debate, started right here in Long Island. Patient zero, first shot of the whole Cold War, well, not metaphorically speaking, started technically right here. So collective security of the world moves to Long Island. Long Island is the dead center of the world with democracy. It's the modeling of what post-war suburbia is supposed to look like. With its failures, with its triumphs, this is where it is. So it's dead center of the world for post-war suburbia, et cetera, et cetera. So why not put the UN? So there's an abandoned plant, the Sperry's plant, a wartime manufacturing plant, and it's abandoned. It represents demobilization of World War II, and it's laying abandoned in Lake Success, right next to Great Neck. I'm going to say what's the length from Manhattan, Karl? Like 20 minutes, 30 minutes?
Yeah,
about 20, 30 minutes by train, Manhattan. Not too far, and it's laying vacant. So local officials, they want to do the global citizen thing, and most of all, they want to get it back on the tax rolls and get Lake Success on the map. So the mayor and many people in Lake Success kind of embraced this idea when the search committee came. So August 29th, 1946, the United Nations building was open and had its first session. So just to give you an idea, the population of Lake Success at the time is 700 people, and 1,500 delegates all around the world descended on this little village. And of course, this right here is the first interim headquarters of Lake Success, of the UN in Lake Success. Sorry about that. But this honeymoon stage of being a global citizen will not last very long, unfortunately. And this is where we kind of get the first shots of the Cold War. Long Island winds up kind of pushing them out. Let's get to this. So the Atomic Energy Commission, it all starts over the Atomic Energy Commission proposed in the United Nations. United States UN Representative Bernard Baruch came up with a compromise for the nuclear arsenal. Under the plan, the United States will destroy its entire nuclear arsenal and cease development of all future atomic weapons. Once again, collective security, peace, that's kind of what the UN is supposed to do. But in return, the commission would, sorry about that. There we go. But in return, the commission will prohibit atomic bombs, period. They would seize the global facilities that developed these illegal bombs, impose harsh sanctions against any nation that attempted to develop atomic bombs, and would restrict all veto power to the nations that violated this treaty or within the commission. So 12 countries signed on right away. Soviet Union was in strong opposition. As a result, April 1st, 1948, the proposed United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, of course, was adjourned indefinitely. And as a result of the failures, United States House Appropriations passed $150 million in extra funds for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to develop atomic weapons and quote unquote energy programs as well. The Cold War literally was birthed right there out of this at Lake Success. So this is definitely not going to work for Lake Success. And guess what? They want Sperry's to come back. Push come to shove, it is the interim headquarters, and there is more pushing factor. And Sperry's is going to open up the plant again, right where the United Nations once was. So does anyone have any questions as I'm going forward so far? Everyone was familiar about the United Nations plant? I mean, United Nations and the Sperry's connection?
So what was the basis of the Russians' opposition?
I'm going to ask Karl on that. Karl, do you know the basis of that?
I don't.
Yeah, I really am not too sure. You know, there's a bunch of, it is an imbalance of power at this time. That is one issue you got to think about. So everyone's worried about throwing off the balance of power here. And it could have been fears from that as well. I'm just shooting in the dark on that because a lot of Soviet opposition against America was about balance of power at the time. Any other questions? Moving on. So Long Island goes on the defense. By 1951, Nassau and Suffolk County will have all schools retrofitted with air raid shelters. The state will pay 25%, the locality will pay 25%, and the federal government will come up with 50% of all new retrofitted public bomb shelters. By 1959, New York State Governor Nelson Rockefeller would propose raising $150 on the average household annually to build shelters throughout the state. A lot of people were in opposition. Anything to do with raising taxes, similar to today, there was opposition. In an editorial, one Rockefeller staffer said, the average American spends $220 on cigarettes and liquor annually, and they cannot afford $150 to save their lives is plain stupid. So this is the mentality. But the reality is, if you have a bomb shelter, it doesn't really protect you. Many scientists debunk this. It just makes you feel you're in control of the situation. These air raid, we were actually talking about it before everyone came on. And we have this, before we actually started the whole lecture. And I'm just going to put you on the spot, Karl. Karl, can you just tell me about your experience in school?
I went to school in Brooklyn and Queens, and we had dog tags where they did the duck and cover exercises, jumping under the desk. Sometimes we went out on the hall. And the fear of a Soviet attack was just extreme. But I've also, let me note, visited Russia through the years, and I've spoken to folks there, and they were as scared and as nervous about being attacked with nuclear weapons by us as we were of the Soviets.
Can you elaborate on what the dog tags are for?
Well, I think if they would be like dog tags for soldiers. If they found our bodies, they could identify us.
So just putting that on kids, exposing them to their own mortality through a public school alone, it's kind of robbing them of their innocence. I just thought that's really interesting, considering the mind frame. And of course, you had a couple of bucks, you can get one of these in your home in Levittown, Shelter Island, East Hampton, or wherever you may be living. So this is interesting. This is kind of what a bomb shelter will look like. I love the air filter. Everything's bombed out and you're just gonna have pristine air underground. That is, I don't even know where to begin with that one. So if there was a nuclear quote unquote holocaust or a nuclear Armageddon, I don't know how long you would actually be able to live, because you actually do need to get up to the surface eventually. Everything is limited. But this is the fears. It was really irrational. But it gripped everyone from the duck and cover drills with Bert the Turtle. I'm sure some of you remember that, Bert the Turtle, duck and cover, which was actually made in Astoria, Queens, to dog tags on having your kids go to school with dog tags to quote unquote identify their bodies if there was ever a nuclear explosion. This is going to produce a lot of anxiety, and it's going to further the flames of the fears of the Soviets. And it's also going to extend the term Reds. It's going to be a loaded term that political opposition is going to use to gain the upper hand. And we'll get to that in 1 second. So let's fast forward. Actually, let's digress a little bit to Levittown. Levittown is going to be the poster child of post-war suburbia. 17,000 plus homes, which were constructed on land surrounding property, which made up towns of Levittown, Island Trees, Wantor, Hicksville, and even East Meadow. Except East Meadow, you had the basements. Levittown, on building these homes, set a record of 36 houses a day. With these developments, though, they were open to all GIs coming home, except for African-American GIs. And this is all going to tie in. The Cold War also has the battles of the civil rights movement, especially in the North, that are forgotten for a lot of the time. And a lot of these civil rights activists that fought against Clause 26 in Levittown, which states the tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race, but employment and maintenance of other than Caucasian domestic servants shall be permitted. And here's the clause right here. I'm sorry you guys can't see it if it's small. I do apologize. I didn't really think of that when I put it in, but the clause is as read, copy and pasted in the slide. But it's going to have a pushback for a civil rights movement, civil rights activities. One of the groups is going to be called the Committee to End Discrimination in Levittown. A lot of soldiers that did fight in World War II, they saw the contradictions of saying they defeated tyranny, only to see it when they come back home. And when they see this, when they see these clauses, they're going to go out there, they're going to protest, they're going to boycott, and they're going to be painted as quote unquote communists, quote unquote Reds. So the term is going to be loaded for anyone that's opposition to what the powers that may be wants. And they're going to play on that anxiety through McCarthy, Goldwater, and it keeps going down the line. And while they're playing on this anxiety, there's also a hidden legacy of Levittown, not just the civil rights struggles, but households are going to become volatile places. The fears of Armageddon, doomsday, and many veterans coming home from World War II that are struggling from the emotional wounds of war. And while this is all going on, all these mental health issues are going to be behind closed doors, because mental health struggles were a sense of shame for a lot of people back then. There was no clear way to diagnose things. A lot of soldiers coming home, they didn't have the concept of post-traumatic stress that we do today. I saw one statistic, what was it, 50% of all wartime marriages ended in divorce because of the wounds of war, because of the anxieties. And with this sense, and you're going to have more of a sense of isolation within these communities with mental health struggles. And people are going to play onto these fears. And mainly it's going to be targeted at a lot of civil rights movers and shakers. Anyone have any questions? Cries of outrage? We're good? Okay. So before we move on, I'm just going to introduce this segment to Karl. And we're all going to see a clip of Karl when a few years back doing a little reporting. I think we'll all appreciate this.
It's a case of humanity getting by through the skin of its teeth. We're at a former Nike base in Rocky Point, Long Island. It and many Nike and Beaumark bases was set up in the New York metropolitan area in the 1950s to blast Soviet bombers out of the sky with nuclear-tipped Nike and Beaumark missiles. These were the first generation of anti-aircraft missiles, so they weren't seen as being able to score direct hits. So instead, the scheme was to have the nuclear warheads on the Nike and Beaumark missiles detonate when they reached a formation of Soviet bombers, blowing the formation apart, but also raining radioactivity down below. This facility in Rocky Point and the others were closed as the Soviets switched from bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. The nuclear tips had enormous power. For the Beaumarks, the equivalent of 10 kilotons. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, had the TNT equivalent of 13 kilotons. The Nike missiles had the power of up to 20 and 30 kilotons. The Beaumarks had a 250-mile range, the Nikes a 100-mile range. It would have been some radioactive rain if they were ever put into use. Here's the guts of the former Nike base in Rocky Point. This is an access hatch which permits soldiers to go down below into a cavernous area where the missiles were stored, the nuclear-tipped Hercules Nike missiles. And if you walk here through all this grass, all quite overgrown, here's the launch site itself. Huge doors, I'd say 40, 50 feet long, welded shut now. They would open, the missile would rise, fired at those feared Soviet bombers heading to New York City.
And that's kind of how they look when they open. Okay. So I'm going to have Karl take over this segment right here. And I do see a question in the chat as well, Karl. I think it's a question.
Yeah, well, here's my good old friend Val Schaffner saying that if we could just jump back off the share for a second so I can see the chat.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Just for a second, because Val,
Yeah.
I think, has the answer to that Stalin. My understanding is that Stalin rejected the Baruch plan because he thought it was a trick to keep Russia from catching up to the US in nuclear technology. The US felt pretty confident about proposing it because they knew he'd reject it. Wow. We can jump back into the share, okay?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
And-
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Val.
So we actually have someone, I'll read this to you. They actually have a little food for thought here. What government agency, what government agency thought it was a good idea to blast Soviet planes out of the sky with nuclear-tipped missiles that would end up killing untold numbers of American citizens in fallout? Well, I'm gonna let Carl answer that.
Well, frankly, I mean, we're talking about Cold War history, but it's not much different. We're talking about suicide. We're talking about nuclear war. This is unwinnable, suicidal. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And importantly, and I wrote an article which appeared this week. I didn't write an article. Annette Hinkle wrote a wonderful article in the Sag Harbor Express, Southampton Press, and East Hampton Press about our new book. And she notes, and I mentioned this to Annette, mention it now because it's so important, that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was set up by scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project during the war, they, in the beginning of 2020, last year, set the doomsday clock. This is the clock that marks apocalypse at midnight. They set it to 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest to midnight to apocalypse since the doomsday clock began way back in after World War II. And here's a statement from the bulletin. Accelerating nuclear programs in multiple countries moved the world into a less stable and manageable territory. Last year, development of hypersonic glide missile vehicles, the missiles, ballistic missile defense, weapons, and so forth. And this year, the beginning of this year, the bulletin kept the doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight. And that's where it is. Remains to be seen where they're going to set it next month, but I bet you it's not going to be pushed back. This is insanity. And people, one thing about the 50s and the 60s, when we had those dog tags and we duck and cover, we were very aware that we were very concerned realistically about the reality, the possibility, the potential of a nuclear exchange. And now, decades later, I mean, my students, I teach at SUNY Old Westbury, and I've been talking to them about this because of the book just coming out. And the students, who are mostly Long Island and New York City students, it's all very vague, the fact that there are silos, still silos, particularly in the Midwest of this country, where soldiers are posted ready to send missiles towards Russia or China. There are submarines, many of them actually produced up in New London, Connecticut, capable and all ready to send missiles flying to Russia or China or wherever. With now many warheads, it's multiple warhead weapons. They make the Hiroshima bomb look, and I hate to diminish the power of the Hiroshima bomb, but small compared to their firepower. And then further in what's called the nuclear triad, we got bombers, B-1s and B-2 bombers ready to drop atomic and hydrogen bombs. To the question, what are these people thinking who have these plans, considering the consequences? I don't know. It was then with these nuclear tipped missiles, which would detonate essentially above our heads, because the Bomark and the Nike Hercules missiles had short ranges. uh, or the folks now in the Pentagon who think war is winnable. Just to read from here, January 61, the US had 18,600 some odd atomic weapons. We now have 13,000. I mean, there's been arms reduction, but 13,000 is still 13,000 too many. And the military purchased acreage, and not just on Long Island. These nuclear and these Bomark missile bases all over the country. They encircle Chicago, for example. We had 7 bases. And also, don't confuse the Nike Hercules for the Nike Ajax. The first generation of Nike missiles were Nike Ajax missiles. Then they switched, they moved to these nuclear-tipped Nike Hercules missiles. And the sites for we're talking about Nike Hercules, Toledo Beach, Brookville, Lloyd Harbor, Tony Log Harbor, Rocky Point, Amityville, and Fort Tilden. A base for Bomark missiles right in West Hampton. And that video, and you can watch the video in full if you would like, just go to put "Avoiding Nuclear Destruction by the Skin of Our Teeth" and my name and YouTube into Google, and you can see the whole half hour. You can get the link and see the whole half hour program. When I got to West Hampton, this is the last 20 minutes of or last 15 minutes of that little video. I run around there's actually buildings. They're still there in West Hampton. They're used to a large degree by Suffolk County to store records. And I was given free reign of that Bomark base. Again, it was turned over to Suffolk County. Crazy, crazy, crazy.
I just put the picture of the West Hampton Bullmark base up for everyone to see on the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I just want.
I was escorted around by the Suffolk County Commissioner of Public Works in charge of dealing with it. So he gave me free reign going into the buildings, looking at the interior, the guts of these buildings, and they're in a couple of rows. It's really haunting. It's scary, frankly. That I mean, just for the east end of Long Island, right in our backyard, were these nuclear-tipped Bomark missiles.
We got a question in the chat. So the first one I'm going to address here. Are you saying Nike missiles like the sports company? Nike is a Greek god of victory.
Yeah.
I believe Nike, the sports company, victory and winning. That's where they got the sneaker name. And you could have got the missile name from that too. I'm not really sure, but it might be. It's where the smoke there's fire. I doubt if it's coincidence. And we also got a question from John here.
Oh, just me insert the Bomark name. That's a little strange. Bomark is for Boeing Michigan Aeronautical Research Center. The two entities partnered to create these. Bomark was an Air Force missile. Nike was an Army missile.
Oh, let's see. We do have this one more question here. Will you say later when the sites were demobilized and what happened to the missiles and nuclear tips?
I don't know what happened to the nuclear tips, nor the missiles, frankly. I had lunch actually just last week with John McDonald, who was a former Newsday reporter. I would have included it in the book, but I didn't know it at the time. He told me about when the nuclear missiles from Amityville were, the base was deactivated, were flown in a helicopter outside off the base. There was some sort of accident, and the helicopter did an emergency landing in Jones Beach, and then all kind of Army military people got there, immediately circled the field. And when according to John, again, he did a story in Newsday about this. when the police came, they were kept away from what occurred by the military. And there were accidents too, as you can imagine, with these nuclear tipped missiles spread all around the country. But I answer the question, I don't know where they took the tips or where they took the missiles.
I know there was one accident in New Jersey, I think, Carl, is that correct?
Yes, there was one in New Jersey with a dispersal of a certain amount of radioactivity.
So, yeah, when Carl uses skin of our teeth, literally this is by the skin of our teeth here. So, while Long Island's arming up on nuclear tipped missiles, you also have the aviation industry, which is budding. And DARPA is going to be given blank checks practically to all these manufacturing plants. So we're going to start with Republic. Republic is known by setting industry records for the P-47 Thunderbolt. Amazing plane. Definitely helped out in the European theater. It was further made famous by Gabby Gabrinsky, the flying ace over Germany, and also made famous as one of the 3 planes that Tuskegee Airmen used as well, which it was the P-47, and then later it was the Red Tail, quote unquote, the Mustang, the Grumman Mustang. But before that, it was the P-47 Thunderbolt. So Republic is going to be innovative when it comes to the Thunderjets, especially with the DARPA money coming in. And Republic, Grumman's, and a lot of these other manufacturing plants, this is going to be a lifeline for them. Because after World War II, they laid practically everyone off and they had to have the management call back who they were going to hire. Republic didn't really diversify into a civilian market as much as Grumman's did a little bit. So Republic stayed strictly with military. One of their first post-war successes was the F-84 Thunderjets, the Thunder Streak, later on the Thunder Flash. This series of jet fighters planes, this is an example right here, had a top speed of 620 miles per hour and were able to carry a nuclear weapon. After October 14th, 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in his Bell X-1 jet, the top speed required to break the sound barrier, FYI, is 700 miles per hour. Republic stepped up their game with a Thunder Chief. The F-105 Thunder Chief, later in 1955, had a Pratt Whitney 2,400,000 pounds of thrust with a top speed of 800 miles per hour, cruising speed of 600, but the later ones were developed at 1,000 miles per hour. Like this innovation, these planes employed up to 29,000 employees in 1956, not counting the subcontractors. With Grumman's, Republic, on the low end, you're looking at over 100,000 people in Long Island employed. And once again, this does not include the subcontractors, which traversed all over Long Island. And of course, this is the Thunder Chief right here. And just in case you guys do not know, Republic Aviation is in Farmingdale, Long Island. So you have to talk about Grumman. So Grumman had a couple of plants. You had the Calverton one and you had the Bethpage one. We're going to touch a little bit on the Bethpage one in a few, but we're going to hit home on the Calverton one. November 24th, 1951, the Navy purchased about an area of 10,000 acres, which made up a bunch of farms in the old Woolworth estate of scrub oak brush forest. In that plant, Calverton's going to develop the E2 Hawkeye, and this is right here, the E2 Hawkeye. The E2 Hawkeye, believe it or not, they still kind of use these today in our arsenal. They were this little weird thing on top. I forgot what it's called. I'm drawing a blank. It's a radar system that's supposed to detect marine vehicles and also submarines. Of course, Grumman's plant in Calverton's known for the F-14. The F-14 is the 1,500 miles per hour with an altitude of 50,000 feet. And this is going to be starting to be produced 1969. and it's going to be retired in the early 2000s. The range is 1,600 miles on a tank, and its most impressive feature was its radar system. Its radar system was equipped with the first microprocessors, and once again, the first microprocessor was essentially tested right here on Long Island with the F-14. Other features were the radar-guided long-range missiles made through Raytheon Corp. Raytheon Corp made I know Raytheon Corp has manufacturing plants in Hauppauge, or at one time. I don't know if they're here anymore, but I believe the missiles were mainly made and the components up in Boston area. So the Phoenix Raytheon missile was 77% accurate, which is, it's kind of scary when you think of it. But the features that stood out on this was the able to deploy the missiles with multiple targets. Once again, the employment of 100,000 Long Islanders making these weapons of war is going to bring an exorbitant amount of wealth, and it's also going to make the tax structure of a lot of local municipalities dependent on Grumman's Republic and many of their subcontractors. So keep that in mind. Just let's put a pin next to that, and we're going to discuss that and build on that as we move on towards the end of this lecture. But just remember, a lot of local municipalities, schools, police forces, et cetera, are going to depend on the tax revenue of these facilities when the facilities generate. So just keep that in the back of your mind. High employment, taxes coming in, and also you have the unintended consequence of dry wells that are leaking, which we're going to discuss once again later in the lecture as well. And just put a pin next to that. Now, the Grumman's facility in Bethpage, it's going to have its claim to fame with the Lunar Module. 1962, Grumman's going to be contracted to build the Lunar Module. Nassau County Eugene Nickerson, in a press conference, stated that the contract will bring just under $2 billion in additional contract work for Grumman's, and several thousand more employees will be hired. So this is going to swell the workforce to 15,000. But unfortunately, we made a deal with the devil on this one. And the devil was von Braun. Von Braun was a Nazi war criminal. He actually is going to work in the Bethpage plant to help out with the Lunar Module. Once again, von Braun is a Nazi war criminal, and he had no regret. He was very vocal about that. So that is something to understand. We did make a deal with the devil, this is one of our biggest flaws, especially in an industry such as Grumman's that quote unquote argues democracy, the promotion of democracy, democratic this, et cetera. But the other person that actually was one of the top engineers was not the devil. It was Thomas Kelly. Thomas Kelly was a local of Merrick, and Thomas Kelly was a genius. There's no doubt about it. And my argument is, if you ever saw Thomas Kelly's resume, he probably could have came up with this without von Braun. The guy was a genius. I still do not know why they appointed von Braun to kind of oversee Kelly. I don't have a clue. But once in orbit, the finished product, the crew will be into the lunar lander once in the moon, and after the exploration, the upper portion of the lander will dock, and the command module on the Earth will return to Earth. So that's at 25,000. I always get this wrong. 25,000 miles per hour. Just think about how insane that is. The command module will crash back to Earth on its return in the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. That is insane to begin with. But this right here, the space race did happen, and it was part of the Cold War and did happen in Bethpage, Long Island. But we cannot forget the fact that a Nazi war criminal was there. They made a deal with the devil. So going back to the Nazi war criminal thing, Karl is going to discuss another Nazi war criminal.
If we can go to the next slide, then this would be Plum Island. Now, the so-called father of Plum Island was Eric Troub. Now, he, like Werner von Braun, and Werner von Braun's, his project was the V2, V for Vengeance rocket for the Nazis. Troub, during World War II, was the laboratory chief at Incel Reims. It was a biological warfare laboratory. He worked directly under Heinrich Himmler. He was a biowarfare fellow focusing on destroying animals. Both brought here, both Troub and Werner von Braun, and nearly 2,000, over 1,500 former Nazi scientists, I don't know how former, were brought here under what was called Project Paperclip. This was in the late 40s, something that was done. I mean, the rationale is we're going to keep these former Nazi scientists away from the Soviets and so forth. In any case, they were brought here, and Werner von Braun very active in developing U.S. space strategy, both the military. I mean, he and his fellow former Nazi scientists were keys to developing the Redstone rocket that was named for the Redstone Army Arsenals in Alabama. It was the first U.S. rocket capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. Went on, he ultimately became associate director of NASA. As to Troub, he had close connections to Long Island. He, in fact, in the 30s was here when he was studying in New York. He was active in Nazi activities in the New York area. And he suggests he had these contacts from being here in the 30s at Fort Detrick. And he encouraged the folks at Fort Detrick to set up a laboratory, kind of like the laboratory he had. And its mission was to poison Soviet livestock, to set up, now in the Cold War period, a comparable laboratory, which was given a mission of going after the livestock of the Soviet Union. And indeed, the lunch I had with John McDonald, John was a longtime investigative reporter for Newsday, and he was able, through the Freedom of Information Act, indeed, it was on the front page of Newsday, this document, it ran into the paper, which acknowledged it was a military document saying that the mission of Plum Island was to poison livestock. And that went on in the early 50s. Then finally, what occurs is that the Pentagon decides that if we did this, if we poisoned the foodstuff of the Soviet Union, at least the meat and all, we'd have to end up feeding millions of Russians. Let's forget it. Let's just nuke them. And what Plum Island then became was an animal disease laboratory to study foreign animal diseases, but also, and this I started writing about in 1971 when I paid my first visit to Plum Island, defensive biological warfare. I mean, where's the line between defensive and offensive? And actually, Newsday too did an excellent, I feel, excellent piece in the 70s after it was revealed that African swine fever had broken out in Cuba. And connecting the dots, Newsday linked that to a CIA operation in the, then the Canal Zone. And Plum Island, where was the only place in the Western Hemisphere where there was African swine fever, to Plum Island. So I don't know what exactly defensive biological warfare involves. At this point, Plum Island is supposed to be replaced by an animal disease center, which is being built right now. It's supposed to open a year and a half in Kansas. Very intelligent place to put such a laboratory. I mean, it's in the cattle capital of the United States, and foot and mouth disease is a big disease that's been studied on Plum Island. the federal government wanted to sell off Plum Island. In fact, Trump wanted to buy it for a golf course a few years ago. That didn't play out. And now environmentalists have been pushing, along with Lee Zeldin, the congressman from the first CD, to somehow preserve Plum Island and to keep research continuing on Plum Island. We can go to the next one now.
Sure. Once again, I want to just hammer home here. Troub, he was in America, and when World War II broke out, he went to go fight for the Nazis. So this is the person we sent to Plum Island to work.
Yeah, and when I was talking about Long Island, his activities, he was a regular at Camp Siegfried. This is in Yaphank, and it was a major Nazi parade ground. In fact, it was surrounded. The Bund built these little houses all around Camp Siegfried on streets like Hitler Street and Goebbels Street and Goering Street and so forth, right here in Suffolk County, not far from all of us. This is in the late 30s.
There we go.
Well, here we're jumping to Brookhaven National Laboratory. And well, long story here, and I did a book a few years ago called Power Crazy, is Lilko turning Shoreham into America's Chernobyl. And Lilko was in fact all but partners with the Long Island Lighting Company in developing nuclear power on Long Island. It started with a nuclear power plant that Con Edison wanted to build actually in Ravenswood in Queens, across from Manhattan. That was stopped by some early anti-nuclear people in the city. And that resulted in Lilko and Brookhaven Lab thinking that, well, if you can't build a nuclear plant in the middle of the city because of population issues, well, Long Island would be perfect. Population comparatively lighter. And also a big nuclear plant needs a million gallons a minute of water as coolant. So Lilko, as I say, partnered when this is in the early 60s, when nuclear was to come to Long Island. Brookhaven, well, the director of Brookhaven Lab was George Vineyard. His wife, very, very much gung-ho for nukes on Long Island, was Phyllis Vineyard. She was on the board of Lilko, paid by Lilko, in fact. And towards the last years, many years of Lilko's existence, William Catacasinos, former assistant director at Brookhaven Lab, was the CEO and the top person at Brookhaven Lab. Brookhaven Lab was essentially set up, and in Power Crazy, I get into this, by the Manhattan Project as the war came to a close, to develop civilian uses of nuclear technology. That's why it was so happy to partner with Lilko. The folks at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and all these Manhattan Project facilities figured that, hey, we can build bigger and more powerful nuclear weapons, and they did. Indeed, under Edward Teller, the hydrogen bomb at another national laboratory, Lawrence Livermore, was the lab that Teller became the director of. But what can you do with nuclear bombs in terms of us keeping our jobs? GE and Westinghouse were the major contractors to the Manhattan Project. They're keeping their contracts. So Brookhaven National Laboratory, in an old Army base in Upton, was seen as a place to develop all kind of other things you could do with nuclear technology, also to conduct atomic research. But from my reading of all the documents, the main focus was developing things you can do with nuclear technology that you could sell, building nuclear-powered cars, building nuclear-powered rockets, nuclear-powered airplanes, and ultimately building nuclear power plants that would, most dangerous way conceivable of boiling water, use fission to boil water to turn a turbine. As the slide notes, meanwhile, Lilko moved ahead to build 7 to 11 nuclear power plants on Long Island. Shoreham, and all the licensing papers for Shoreham, it's Shoreham Nuclear Power Station 1. There would be 3 at Shoreham, 4 at Jamesport. In fact, at one point, Loco had the bright idea to build a nuclear power plant in Bridgehampton. And as the slide notes, there was all kind of opposition, grassroots opposition and government opposition, led by Suffolk County. And at that point, Mario Cuomo, the governor, joined into that opposition. Then I think there's another half of this slide. We can just jump to the rest of this slide, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. The big, in my judgment, the biggest, I shouldn't say big, the biggest, because the biggest Cold War sin of Brookhaven National Laboratory was its involvement in monitoring the radiation effects among the people of the Marshall Islands. I mean, the US tested 67 atomic and hydrogen bombs right off the Marshall Islands. It was a horror show. And B&L doctors were given the assignment of going from here on Long Island to the Marshall Islands to monitor the situation with these poor folks. Well, as the slide says, they fail to share the knowledge that they had about the effects of radiation among these people. I cite a lot here from Glenn Alcalay. Glenn is a professor today of anthropology in New York, and he was a Peace Corps volunteer on the Marshall Islands, and he was there seeing the aftermath of what occurred, and he got very involved in a major litigation and so forth. There was a big settlement for the people, but they may have gotten bucks, but their health was, of so many of them, people died, people widely got cancer and so forth. And as Glenn emphasizes, that these doctors at Brookhaven National Laboratory, they considered these poor victims guinea pigs to determine through this huge experiment of the bombs being blown up off Marshall Islands, the effects on people of radioactivity.
Just to throw it out there too, another experiment they did was the classic gamma forest in Brookhaven Labs. I think it was about 100 acres, correct me if I'm wrong. They just pretty much just put radiation on oak brush pines just to see what effect it has on forest on Long Island. So that is, the contamination also went locally as well. And we'll also discuss in later slides about the water table and the reactors. And
well, the leaking of tritium into the water at Brook, I mean, that's what ultimately closed the high flux beam reactor, and there was a medical reactor there, the leaking. But I've always wondered whether it was leaking or they just allowed that tritium to just get out. An example which I include in Cold War Long Island of the attitude towards Brookhaven Lab to radioactivity involves somebody a lot of us this evening know, Cy Perchik, who was an assistant Suffolk district attorney in charge of prosecuting environmental crime. And his brother, Arthur Hum, Cy lives in the town of East Hampton. His brother-in-law, Arthur Hum, worked at Brookhaven Lab. And because Cy was going after the lab, they were not speaking terms anymore until Arthur Hum was on his deathbed from cancer. One of his major jobs at the lab was in a radioactive waste pool that was emptied, scrubbing the residue off the sides of this waste pool, given as he told Cy on his deathbed, given no masks, no protection. In my first book, actually, A Nuclear Power Cover-Up, What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power, I reprint as a facsimile a bunch of pages from the safety manual at Brookhaven National Laboratory, which begins, is radioactivity dangerous? It can be, but not necessarily, and so forth. I mean, these folks, through the decades and today, have not taken, in my judgment, radioactivity seriously because it so involves their work through the decades.
And this also reflects the mortality rate on a lot of their workers as well.
Yeah, well, the Department of Energy a number of years ago, I mean, with all the claims that, is it dangerous? Doesn't have to be, set up a huge fund, multi-billion-dollar fund for not only folks who worked at Brookhaven Lab, but folks who worked at these other national nuclear labs, Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, so forth. In fact, every several weeks or maybe every month or so these days, you'll see an ad, sometimes a full-page ad in Newsday, and sometimes the local papers by an attorney saying if you've been affected, if you develop cancer and you worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory, connect with me. We would join in to get money for you from this fund.
We're going to discuss a little bit later into the presentation is actually the effects on the drinking water of the communities of Shirley, Mastic Beach, and other neighboring communities as well. So another big factor of the Cold War Long Island is, besides Brookhaven Labs, Plum Island, and the manufacturing plants and having the UN here, was the actual people that fought in Cold War wars. So the biggest fallacy that drives me nuts as a history professor is when people say it's a war of words. That is not true. It's a war of proxy wars. There was a lot of warfare. The Korean War was a product of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was a product of the Cold War, and people died. So it's not a war of words. And of course, the Soviet-Afghan War was a product of the Cold War. Once again, it's not a war of words. These wars had an exorbitant amount of people perish. And once again, they're Cold War wars. So it's a little gripe of mine, just getting it out there. And we're going to unpack it on a local level. An estimated 482,000 New Yorkers would serve in the Korean War, and 2,300 were killed. In the Vietnam War, it'll be an estimated 1 million New Yorkers that would serve during a span of 16 years. And during the span of 16 years throughout New York, 4,100 would perish in the Vietnam War. And that's a huge number, estimated 1 million New Yorkers. It was an estimated 1 million New Yorkers, or just under, that served in World War II. So just to give you a little idea, and of course, one of the people that did serve in the Vietnam War was my father. So, and he still has the wounds from the war as well. Emotionally speaking, not physically. Both wars were a result of Cold War tensions. So let's divorce the concept of a war of words. Despite the common belief that the Cold War was a war of words, it built many, many, many tensions. In Suffolk County, on the eve of the escalation of Vietnam, they were strongly anti-communist, and the anti-communist message generally resonated. Sorry about that. And during the election between Barry Goldwater and hardliner, Barry Goldwater, the highliner that wanted to use nukes in Vietnam, and Lyndon B. Johnson, Goldwater would receive 44% of the vote. And I know this doesn't sound like much, but throughout the entire state of New York, Goldwater received the majority of the popular vote in Suffolk County. It was so crazy that when there was the blackout in 1965, many locals in Suffolk County thought the quote unquote communist Russians were invaded in Montauk, and that's why there was a blackout. So Suffolk County is very strongly anti-Soviet around this time. And in addition to being anti-Soviet, they are going to take a lot of losses with the Vietnam War. So during the Johnson's administration, the Vietnam War did escalate, and the Gallup poll reflected 60% of Americans that supported the escalation of the war and 24% that opposed it. So while doing this book, I just want to break this down. I interviewed a lot of Vietnam veterans, including my father. I sat down and talked to about it. And, you know, first of all, first thing is, I'm going to go with 98% of them do not want to talk about the war. That's number one. For good reason, for very good reason, including my father. I found out that my father was in Vietnam probably when I was a teenager. I think I was like 16, 17 years old, because he never talked about it. I thought his friends were just angry people that used to just stare blankly around Veterans Day. I never put two and two together. I never put two and two together at all. But it makes a lot more sense when I knew. But 98% do not want to discuss it. It's a very painful experience. The coming home experience, the actual war itself, it's a very painful experience. And that's something that should be noted. The other thing that was noted, most of the people I spoke to about the Vietnam War when they were and were veterans, I asked them a simple question: did you know where Vietnam was before you went off to the war? And most of them did not. Most of them came straight from high school. Most of them came from academic probation in college. But the majority did not know where Vietnam was on a map. Very few did. So that is just to put out there. In Long Island, the first casualty of Vietnam is going to be James Raymond O'Neill of Levittown. He's flying his B-26 over South Vietnam to investigate a growing threat from communist guerrillas. And his plane's going to have trouble. They're not going to confirm or deny if it was shot down. He's going to eject before crashing and never be heard of again. The second casualty is going to be this gentleman right here. His name is Parker Dresser Kramer. He's an Army first lieutenant, and he's from Wantor. 1963, he's going to be killed in South Vietnam. Following his death, an American-backed South Vietnamese First Lady, Madame New, is going to come to America and meet with the family, give her condolences, and say, oh, you know, this is just an outlier, this event. Well, 1963 and was pretty much a prequel of what's going to happen, because during Tet Offensive, an average of 105 men a day, 105 Americans a day were being killed over in Vietnam, not counting the carpet bomb and the not counting the napalm and the Agent Orange, which was being exposed to many locals. And I think we still do not have an accurate number on that, because that number fluctuates by a lot, unfortunately. So as the Vietnam War is escalating, and you also having the draft escalating, you're going to have a huge counter-protest movement that's going to be popping up everywhere on Long Island. You're going to have high schools of seniors that knew that, hey, guess what? As soon as they graduate, they better hurry off to college or they're getting drafted. They're going to be staging protests about the war. You have protests at a lot of local draft boards. 1970, Hofstra Weller Hall students of Students Mobilization Committee staged a 12-hour sit-in over getting rid of the Reserve Officers Training Program in Hofstra. May 6th of that year, CW Post, Dowling, Hofstra, Nassau Community, Suffolk Community suspended classes due to collective student sit-ins and occupations. Actually, later on, it will be because of the Kent State shooting and also the expansion of Cambodia, the war into Cambodia, which is another country in Indochina. You got Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Those are the three countries where Vietnam was being fought. And of course, the biggest protest, which turned messy, was Stony Brook University. 900 demonstrators started off peaceful. But with a lot of pushback with local security and police coming in, fire bombs were detonated in Tabor Hall and the Humanities Building and the groundskeeping facilities. Then most of those protesters would march from Stony Brook all the way to Smithtown to go to the draft office to protest the draft board. Once again, the hundreds of protesters that did surround the draft board, they did break up eventually with no violence. But this is the tensions going on in Long Island. It's a highly contentious issue because all a lot of high school students know is that they're going to leave high school, they're going to get drafted, and they're going to go somewhere they can't spell, and they're going to die. That is what's going on right now. So there's a lot of fear. And on top of that, it's not just fear of dying, it's fear of coming back, coming back like emotionally distraught. A lot of soldiers are going to be coming home emotionally distraught. Suicide rates are going to be jumping through the roofs. And a lot of people are going to see that with their brothers, their relatives, their friends, their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. But the biggest thing the Vietnam vet in Long Island did lose was the not just the anti-war movement, but also the Agent Orange poisoning. We're going to get into that in a second. So when the war ends, I think the town that got the most casualties in Vietnam is going to be Levittown. But the one that has the most in Long Island, geographically speaking, Queens, Brooklyn, Nassau, et cetera, is going to be Flushing High School, Flushing and Jamaica. They're the ones that are going to have the most casualties. In Nassau and Suffolk, Nassau is going to have, it's going to be Levittown between Nassau and Suffolk. Coming home is best summed up. Someone told me this, that was a Vietnam vet. Coming home, the Vietnam veteran felt he was treated lower than whale shit, which was oceans and oceans deep. Excuse the language, but I'm trying to give you the authentic actual quote. A lot of soldiers felt isolated wearing their uniforms. There was limited help to the emotional stress, and a lot of World War II vets at the time were not welcomed to the AMVET post because a lot of World War II vets had a hard time understanding that Vietnam was an actual war and not a police action. May 7th, 1985, Ed Koch would give them the victory parade, the coming home parade. That'll be 10 years after the fact. The war became so, they had so much disdain throughout Long Island and America abroad. The Pew Research poll in 1975, 25% of Americans trusted the government after Vietnam. And this is interesting because that number is going to stick for a while and have long-term effects. The unconfirmed reports of death of American soldiers that died from suicide or drug overdose or misadventure through one of those two is going to be about estimated 50,000 or more.
Could I ask a question or make a comment?
Sure, John, please.
On the stories about the way people in uniform were treated, I'd be a little cautious about them. A lot of the stories, the spitting stories and the maltreatment stories didn't really emerge until years after the war ended, and they emerged when, you know, those films started circulating, the Rambo films. There's a veteran, I'm blanking on his name right now, who's done a book going after a lot of those stories, and they simply weren't true, but it was part of the Burns Novick Vietnam series, as though the anti-war movement and veterans or people in service were enemies of each other. And in fact, there was a lot of support from anti-war people for active duty military. There were coffee houses around bases and a fairly strong and positive relationship. So it's just, I'd want to go back to your sources on exactly what was happening and whether it was individual stories or a story that I heard kind of the situation.
Sure. So I just want to build on that. In the book, I do elaborate. There is a distinction. I'm not saying anti-war protesters or all of them were spitting on veterans. There is a distinction on that. You also have Vietnam Veterans for Peace, which was a huge anti-war movement as well. Once again, I do make these distinctions. I was elaborating on individual interviews I had with soldiers coming home. And one of those were my father as well, who didn't really have the most pleasant experience, to say the least, coming off the plane, coming home in LaGuardia Airport, to be specific, or maybe JFK. Well, one of those two. It kind of loses me at the time, but I'm basing it off of individual stories. Okay. Did I address your question, John?
Yeah, and I'd love to, after this, exchange email addresses, and or I'll put mine in the chat, and we can follow up and try and figure out particular stories. Okay.
Yeah, sure. And you know, I'm always looking to expand on stuff that's here as well. So I'll love to know. Thanks again, John.
Yep.
The other thing about that we do have a lot of documentation was actually the Agent Orange. So Victor Yatacone, this guy is one of the most amazing attorneys, the end. And I have to say, Carl is the one that put me in contact with Victor. So I remember when Carl spoke to me on this, he's like, when I'm doing this part of it, and he's like, I got to put you in contact with this guy, Victor. He has a story to tell. And I'm like, yeah, it's just going to be on Agent Orange. No, this story traversed about 4 days at 3 hours a pop on each recording. So let me tell you, I still don't think I know everything about this, because Victor has more than a story to tell. So little background knowledge on Victor Yatacone of Patchogue, Long Island. He was also the judge of Patchogue Village. Is that correct, Carl? Yeah.
He might still be.
He might still be. Okay. Victor Yatacone, Baker Street, he had his practice. He had a story to tell. This is the guy that literally, he told me on this, it was his case with DDT that coined the term environmental law in a Riverhead courtroom. So that is how impactful Victor Yatacone was. So the last thing he wanted to do after the DDT litigation, the last thing he wanted to do was another big litigation like DDT. He just wanted to relax, take it back, chill. So Vietnam, someone said something? So there was a Vietnam veteran called Frank McCarthy that he was trying to cover. He was trying to like understand why so many Vietnam veterans seem to be dying of cancers, various cancers. There's one guy, Rudished, I think I said his name right. He had a cancer that was just abnormal. It was a very rare soft tissue cancer that he was suffering from. And he later on will succumb to it as well. So they were trying to build an organization, Vietnam Vets Against Agent Orange, because they believed it was coming from this chemical called Agent Orange. Frank McCarthy is going to drive all the way to Victor Yatacone's house in Patchogue, camp out in his driveway until he agrees to take the case. Now, I just totally summed up about an hour of this conversation with Victor about this. And what he's going to find is that there's going to be a lot of veterans that are going to succumb to this dioxin-based chemical called Agent Orange. This guy right here is Parenti, John Parenti. John Parenti, actually, he's still with us today. And he also is a recipient of this case as well. And he's from Hauppauge, Long Island. John had multiple cancers, and lucky him, he's still with us. And John is also a cyclist, and I kind of know John from the cycling community as well. But once again, it's the dioxin base in the chemical that was killing off the veterans. So the Agent Orange litigation started right here in Long Island with Victor Yatacone and Frank McCarthy, Long Island-based attorney. And eventually the final settlement will be $180 million and $61,000 in interest a day. And like, first of all, I'm not even sure if Vietnam got anything out of this, because they definitely got the brunt of it. An estimated 12 to 20 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed in Vietnam that destroyed the dense jungle. Now, just based on what we know in the soldiers coming home, a lot of soldiers, their kids will have birth defects. They will have various forms of cancer, and this will go through decades at a time. So I imagine the birth defects are even worse in Vietnam. Any questions so far? Comments?
Just a quick addition. I do a lot of work on Vietnam. That's why I'm intervening. But it took the U.S. a long, long time, but finally we have provided assistance to clean Agent Orange out of first the Da Nang Air Base and now Bien Hoa. We've gradually acknowledged some responsibility for victims, which are in the third generation now, but mostly we don't acknowledge that that's why they're getting the assistance. Senator Leahy has been an extraordinary force in trying to deal with this, but you know, we have been very partially, the military is reluctant to take responsibility for the consequences of any war, any place. And so Agent Orange is a subset of that. So sorry,
No.
Yeah.
Please. Now, I will say this, even during that case, no one was taking responsibility.
Yeah.
Nope.
Oh yeah. No. They settled out of court. It was, and the Vietnamese, to answer your question, got absolutely nothing. The Vietnamese tried to bring a separate suit, but it was thrown out of court. So that.
Even the chemical companies too, they didn't go.
Yeah. They went after the chemical companies, and the chemical companies said they were just fulfilling a government contract. And again, part of the history is that to try to produce more Agent Orange more rapidly, the chemical companies knew that it had a higher dioxin. If they had produced less of it more slowly, it would have had a lower dioxin rate. But the chemical companies knew that. So that was in both the veterans case and in the Vietnamese case.
It's funny because when I spoke to Victor, he actually, he tells me that exactly, that's in the book detail as well, but he tells me that they were actually he found these papers as they were getting rid of them in dumpsters. And came to him with a box of papers that actually cited exactly what you said, which was interesting. And you had various forms of Agent Orange that produced different levels of the dioxin. So it's actually interesting on how they tried covering it up through throwing them out. Thank you for sharing.
Sure. It's fascinating to see the localization of these things that I've been working on for decades. So
what do you do exactly, if you don't mind me? Asking?
Sure, I run a not-for-profit called the Fund for Reconciliation and Development, and I'm based in Riverhead. But for many years, we worked on normalization of relations and post-war legacy issues. And a colleague is still, the War Legacies Project is the best place to go if you want to know the whole Agent Orange picture there and here.
No, I'm definitely be exchanging information with you if that's okay.
Right. For sure.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
I'll try and keep my mouth shut.
No. Please. Look, this is interactive. The last thing I want to do is talk to myself for an hour and a half. So I definitely love to hear people acknowledge that I'm talking and contribute. So even in my college classes, I tell my students, please talk. Like the worst thing you can do is talk to yourself for 3 hours straight. So especially with Zoom, it's so impersonal. So thank you so much. Now fast forward a little bit. This is called the Long Island Rust Belt. And you know where this is going to go with environmental destruction, but all the stuff that we didn't know about. So the Fairchild and Republic Aviation, like I said prior, Republic's could be one of the biggest aviation organizations here in military contracts, and eventually they're going to merge with Fairchild. And their T-46A jet trainer is going to be canceled. And Republic at this time, in 1985, 1986, they're going contract to contract on their budget right now. And the cancellation of this is because Senator Goldwater, the $3 billion price reduction tag on the Graham-Rudman deficit reduction law. So it's going to be canceled, and this is going to be the nail in the coffin for Republic. But here's the thing. Republic, Grummans, they're all kind of competition, but they're frenemies in the end. One goes out, the other's going out. It's the canary in the coal mine, essentially. So it's going to be wiped out. And guess what? The next one to go is Grummans. They're going to be bought out. And after they're bought out, they're going to merge and move all production out of Long Island. The F-14D was drying up on contracts. Once again, it's the same F-14. It was drying up on contracts. The Calverton plant was going bare. And by 1992, the last F-14 came off the Calverton airfield, which ended the largest military airplane program on Long Island. By 1994, the last of the military manufacturers was sold off to Northrop, and an estimated 100,000 jobs were lost. And remember, I told you, everyone, in the beginning of this, how we all got dependent on the revenue that was being generated from these plants? Well, guess what? Most schools were seeing deficits. Some schools even lost $500,000 a year in tax revenue. One specific, I actually did the research on, was East Islip School District, which was running on an austerity budget for, I don't want to say a decade, but pretty close to it, because Grumman's in Great River folded. It was an electrical plant. And of course, we have to discuss the gift that keeps on giving, the plumes. So this is interesting. We all had, the Grumman's had an idea about the contamination. So did Karl says he believed Brookhaven Labs had an idea about the contamination, which they did. If it was on purpose or an accident, that's the question. So in Suffolk County, they're going to have 109 Superfund sites. Nassau is going to have 145 Superfund sites. The water contamination is going to represent 90% of these. The most common chemical, of course, is going to be PCE, PCBs, and they're all going to be coming from mainly the Lake Success Ferries plant, where the United Nations was, of course, and the Brookhaven National Labs and Bethpage Grumman's. And I did not put up there, and I apologize because it slipped my mind, Calverton, because we don't know how bad the Calverton dry well was. Brookhaven National Labs, Karl, correct me if I'm wrong, they're going to, what's the radioactive material they're going to leak?
It's tritium. And when tritium gets into water, you really can't get it out. It has a long half-life. It has a radiohazardous lifetime of a couple of centuries, but that's what came out of the reactors at Brookhaven Lab.
So Brookhaven Labs, now, didn't they deny it? Can you elaborate how they denied it at first?
Well, it actually, in terms of the pollution, my first story done, this would be in the 70s, about the Peconic River. I got a New York State Health Department report, which identified the Peconic River as the second most radioactive river in New York State, next to Cattaraugus Creek, upstate, where there was a plant of recycling nuclear waste and so forth. And what Brookhaven Lab told me, and I did a big story, it was the East Hampton Star, huge story quoting their officials, is that this was fallout from nuclear weapons tests. And somehow this fallout came here to the east, and that's what was the plutonium and the whatever in Peconic River. That's where it came from. Then years later, many years later, it turned out that BNL admitted that as it sought to upgrade its waste treatment plant, that with the former waste treatment plant, there were nuclear emissions from the lab came out the waste treatment plant into the Peconic River. So it's been denial. I mean, Brookhaven Lab scientists, when the tritium uproar occurred, which caused associated universities, which is Harvard and Yale and MIT and so forth, which managed the lab from its start until that point, and it got fired. When all this occurred, Brookhaven lab scientists were saying, well, there's tritium in exit signs. What's the big deal about the tritium? And that doesn't, it dodges the question of whether there should be tritium in exit signs. And they just did not want to come to grips with this carcinogenic substance, tritium. And here's a wonderful book, Welcome to Shirley, a memoir of an atomic town by Kelly McMasters, who teaches at Hofstra. And it was also a good documentary made on the basis of Kelly's book about Shirley and cancer being epidemic in Shirley, which is, when you talk about the underground water table, it flows from midway on Long Island, south or north. And in terms of Brookhaven Labs flow, it's to the south, to Shirley, which is right to the south of it. What they do these Brookhaven Lab scientists wouldn't take responsibility for the gravity here in terms of the poisons that, in my judgment, they allowed. I mean, they would claim, what's the big problem? It's an exercise. It just seemed to be an issue that they were concerned about. Again, Kelly's book is excellent, and Atomic States of America, excellent, both well documenting the devastation done to lots of people in Shirley by the tritium that was leaked from Brookhaven Lab.
I just put the book in the chat, guys, just in case. And once again, the lab, it talks about the waste cluster impact on the water and the cancer rates of Mastic, Shirley, and Mastic Beach. I think she touched on Annabelle.
It's actually wider than, I mean, those were the communities that were particularly hit. I mean, it's gone. When the high flux beam reactor was in operation, we went down the Long Island Expressway. You saw a big stack just to the north of the Long Island Expressway. That was the stack of the high flux beam reactor, which every day emitted radioactive effluents and so forth. Again, the high flux beam reactor was closed. The medical reactor was closed. There was earlier a graphite reactor at the lab, 3 reactors in all. Now, Long Island is now nuclear free with the closure of all these nuclear facilities at Brookhaven Lab.
I will say this, though. Once again, this is a little diagram right here. And I was going crazy looking for one that was easy to read. This is our water table here on Long Island, and this is how fragile it is. You get the upper glacier aquifer, the behemoth aquifer, and then you get a layer of clay, and then you get the Lloyd aquifer. So we don't use the upper glacier aquifer. It's too polluted. It's done. We don't use that. And with these aquifer systems, it's an estimated about 138 million gallons of fresh water a year comes from them for the residents of Long Island. And essentially, they're fragile. We don't use this aquifer as polluted, and this is really limited. So you got, I think it's the plume, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the plume in Bethpage, which is the next slide. Wait, no, it's not. The plume in Bethpage, which is, it's from Grumman's plant. It's from a dry well that leaked. It's about 4.3 miles long and 2 miles wide and 900 feet deep below the ground. Well, the behemoth, I can't ever say this right, the behemoth aquifer is 1,100 feet below the ground. So it's literally knocking on the door of contaminating the next aquifer. And this is essential because 90% of Nassau County gets their drinking water from there. And I believe it's 50% of Suffolk gets their drinking water from that western Long Island aquifer as well, which traverses all across into the Pine Barrens as well. But we're talking about the contamination starting in Bethpage, western Suffolk area. And once again, they are doing something to clean it up, but it's projected to take about 75 to 100 years at a cost of $585 million. Now, trying to be a little optimistic here, leaving an optimistic note, let's assume they come up with new technology, technology advances. Maybe it'll be, maybe 40 years, who knows? But that's still a long time to get the plume out. And this goes to the same with Brookhaven Labs with their toxic as well, with their chemicals that they put into the ground as well. And once again, I'm also going to blame it a lot on the Gamma Forest. That Gamma Forest project by far is, I don't even know where to begin on that. That definitely had to have a long-term effect on the drinking water in the Pine Barren region as well. But economically speaking, with Long Island, the unintended consequences of the Cold War was the gross domestic product of Long Island is going to be at one point larger than 21 states. After the Cold War, it's going to take 2007 to have Long Island reach that milestone again. But one of the biggest problems we're going to have, besides the contamination, is going to be the ballooned tax base of a lot of these manufacturing plants leaving and us not diversifying the tax base. And that's why we're going to have some of the probably the highest, one of the many reasons of why we have some of the highest property taxes, especially on schools in the nation. So I know this went a little bit longer than anticipated, but I think we had a great eventful discussion. So I'll just leave the floor open if anyone has any questions, thoughts. You can unmute yourself, put in the chat. Questions, thoughts, anyone? Carl, you have anything to add?
No, it's again, we tried to put the book together, focusing on a variety of issues. And really in this presentation, we've gotten to all that we dealt with within the book. And as you said, when we started today, Chris, afternoon, I lived through some of this stuff. We have a passage in the book about Soviet espionage.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a spy, Soviet spy, right here in Suffolk County, Robert Glenn Thompson from Bay Shore, and I covered that. He used to, though he claimed he was not guilty for a while, his job was traveling around the New York area, taking pictures of bridges and so forth, and other strategic targets, and exchanging the film at the International Bridge in Niagara Falls with us and so forth. There's so much more in the book and lots of photographs and so forth. But getting back to the skin of our teeth, we just barely got through all this. And a note on the chat from Joe Mangano. He's the executive director of the Radiation and Public Health Project. And he talks about, and I'm a member of the board of the Radiation Public Health Project, the importance of the whole cancer issue, which really, a lot of the origins of the project are here on Long Island. Again, we try to pack the book with a variety of issues involving the Cold War.
So if anyone has any thoughts, comments, floor is open.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think it was fascinating, and you wonder about the echoes of that in the sort of conservative pro-Trump politics that still show up in Suffolk County, Nassau County. How much of the Cold War mentality and funding still echoes through when you saw the caravans going of Trump supporters driving from Nassau through Suffolk County and the way the votes came out. Whether that's just coincidental or whether you could actually trace back some of the money that was brought in as part of the military buildup that still has echoes in contemporary politics since the.
Well, I will say the messaging of calling everyone a socialist and a communist to say that they're the bad guy, weaponizing as weaponization, which is used in politics in general, he's a socialist, as you keep hearing one party refer to the other party as. That's definitely an echo of the Cold War. But a lot of that funding is coming from the Mercer family. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carl.
Well, there's long been a far right. It's more than a tendency in Suffolk County. I mean, the first time I met Chris Verga, he was giving a talk at the Suffolk County Historical Society's museum in Riverhead, and I knew that there was slavery here. I mean, anybody visits Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island knows that, that there was significant slavery here. But I never knew how significant it was until Chris's lecture. Long Island was a major, in terms of numbers of slaves, very significant during the slavery period. Go back before the slavery period. I mean, just consider Suffolk County was a Tory, very, very conservative. Chris is an expert on the Ku Klux Klan and the political involvement, deep political involvement of the Ku Klux Klan. And I didn't know until I heard Chris speak about how a big opponent back in the 1920s of the Ku Klux Klan, 1930s, was the Catholic Church, because the Ku Klux Klan was so anti-immigrant. They didn't like these Irish people coming over and so forth. And so much of the centuries-long history of Suffolk County echoes today. It echoed during the Cold War period, and it echoes, I mean, God knows what's going to happen in a couple of years if Trump and his anti-immigrant agenda, his crazy politics, arch conservative politics, his tie-in with people who really do not believe in this experiment in democracy, which is the United States. So the Cold War period is I think, a very important time to consider in terms of the lessons it should teach and the folly, the absolute folly. I mean, we're just talking about reconciliation in Vietnam. I mean, it was my generation where they were pulling us out of college to go over to Vietnam. But, you go to Kmart, and where are the shoes from? Vietnam. Where is a shirt from? Vietnam. We're in friendly. I mean, here so many got killed. U.S. over 60,000, and I think the estimate is 2 million Vietnamese for this ridiculous war. And there was Kissinger talking about the domino theory, and if Vietnam went communist, then there would be these dominoes falling, and all of Southeast Asia would, and so forth. And lots of people on Long Island believe that. Maybe someday, I don't know if in my lifetime, we'll get out of this. And my I don't know, highest concern is what the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists are talking about: nuclear apocalypse. I mean, if there's a connection to the Ukraine, some sort of Russian interaction with the Ukraine, and the United States moves in, there's been discussion of the use of atomic weapons. If China goes after Taiwan, again, discussion of use of atomic weapons. This nuclear nightmare is not over. And to say the least. And I think the highest priority needs to be well, what I've advocated for years, the denuclearization of the planet. No nuclear power plants, which are actually factories that produce the plutonium for nuclear weapons, and no nuclear weapons. Because if we're to survive, you can only go by the skin of your teeth for so long. It's a cliche, but you can only be lucky for so long. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came inches from a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. My highest priority is to eliminate, to have nuclear weapons eliminated. The same way after World War I, there was a realization that chemical warfare is just horrific. And so there was a bunch of treaties in the 1920s to prohibit, to outlaw the use of nuclear weapons. They've not held 100%, but they've held pretty much so. I think the same thing has to happen in terms of nuclear weaponry, but there has to be a realization, there has to be an awareness by people in general of the folly, the stupidity, the unwinnability, just the suicidal nature of a nuclear conflict. And as I say earlier, when I was a kid growing up, we were very aware of a nuclear war. As I note, I've been to Russia bunches of times, giving talks actually about nuclear issues. They were going through the same thing. The folly has to end, if we can end it, before it consumes large, unbelievable numbers of people, before it consumes. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but if the nuclear weapons that are on those submarines, on those bombers, in those silos today, and the Soviets have the same amount, the Chinese are building up their inventory of nuclear weapons now. If there is use, years ago, there was that movie, The Day After. In fact, I think Sag Harbor Documentary Festival, they showed a documentary about the making of The Day After, and how important it was to illuminate, to make people aware about the consequences of nuclear war. We need to see 100 days after made and be broadcast and be the sound used on radio, and people would find it hard to read books about this. But change normally comes after a catastrophe like Vietnam War, and people see the folly, the ridiculousness, the fatal impacts. We can't wait for a catastrophe on this. And I think communications is so critical. And as I say, the Cold War era really provides lessons of how stupid, how absolutely stupid, and particularly our leadership can be. Dr. Helen Caldecott, who just sent me an email about our book, which she really thought was important, said years ago, I covered a demonstration up in New Hampshire where Helen spoke, and she talked about being at the crossroads of time in the hands of lunatics. And we still, in my view, are very much in the hands of lunatics. And we are at the crossroads of time.
I will add, though, about great media that brings up the severity of the Cold War. Now, no one judge me, but it's one of my favorite movies, Dr. Strangelove. I think that movie is so impactful. On like after my friends and I watched it, like sometimes we get into that old vintage movie thing. It just shows the madness. How one crazy. Well, has everyone seen Dr. Strangelove? Everyone? Yes? No? It just shows the madness about nuclear weapons. I strongly, strongly recommend you to watch it. And they do it through a satire. But the thing is, you walk away after that movie, you're laughing, but then you're like, oh crap, that can really happen. That can really, really happen. It was Stanley Kubrick that did it, right? That directed it.
Yeah.
Most amazing movie, but it just talks about the lethalness here, so I strongly recommend that movie too.
Well,
So
go back, remember at the early part of the program when you're talking about the proposal that the US made that it would close down all of its nuclear weapons, and the Russians objected to that. Obviously, the Russians, we know, were busily developing their own, and they just didn't trust that the US was going to be that honorable about it. I mean, that sort of mutual distrust issue is the underlying problem, where there's always objective causes for that distrust, but ultimately it's the distrust, whether it's between us and the Russians, or us and the Chinese, or us and the Cubans, and finding the ways to get beyond that distrust is the primary question, I think, for both diplomacy and for any kind of social philosophy.
Well, a big impediment too has been when Reagan met with Gorbachev in Iceland, in Reykjavik. My understanding was that Gorbachev was open to nuclear disarmament, and here Reagan was too. But Gorbachev insisted that there'd be no Star Wars, the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. I've been doing a lot of journalism in the last year or two since Trump created this new Space Force. And that could be beyond a war over Taiwan and a war over Ukraine. That in coming months or years, because the US is, just Google my name and you put in Star Wars, you'll see these many articles I've written. The US has begun to deploy offensive weapons. The original Star Wars, the Reagan Star Wars, was predicated on orbital battle platforms with hypervelocity guns and particle beams and laser weapons, all of which the US military is back considering. And on the battle platforms, talking about idiocy, nuclear reactors and super plutonium systems providing energy for these weapons. James Abramson, who was the head of SDI's so-called Star Wars program, he said at a conference at one point, unless we have an extension cord, he was being sarcastic, going down to Earth and bringing up power for these weapons, you're going to need nukes in space. Again, this deja vu of Star Wars is happening before our eyes. Biden has gone along with it, with the Space Force. And that's going to result, I think, again, I've discussed this in Russia. I've been to China, and I've been told by folks in both countries, talking about diplomats, we don't want to expend our national treasuries on deploying weapons in space. It isn't like buying a Bradley fighting vehicle. We're talking billions upon billions. But they've told me very clearly, if the US does it, we're going to do it too. And just a few weeks ago, you saw a Russian anti-satellite weapon used on a form, so stupidly creating all this debris in space. But we're heading in a direction in terms of turning space into a war zone that gets us closer and closer to 1,000 or to 100 seconds to midnight. And again, I've been doing a lot of journalism on this, but I feel so lonely. This is not being widely reported. This move by the United States, essentially, into space to develop space as a war zone.
I actually put one of Karl's articles in the chat, guys, if you're interested. It's definitely a good read. I read the specific one. This is a good one. It's in the chat. I also put articles that we was discussing prior on one I wrote about the Ku Klux Klan in Long Island, if you guys are interested in that as well. I just want to, someone said, hold on one second, Carl. I just want to make sure we address everyone here. Okay, so we got another couple of people brought up questions about the conservative movement. So as Carl said, the conservatives, Long Island was historically, you always had a extreme right-wing movement, always in Long Island, from the KKK to the Christian Front. Anyone know the Christian Front? Okay, so their alliance was the German Bund, which was the American Nazi Party, I argue. The Christian Front is a strongly anti-Semitic, segregationist, strongly right-wing, pro-fascist group, which was started from Christian fundamentalists in Wisconsin. And, you know, they say they got this one guy, but pretty much it's a bunch of organizations that came together at the end of the day. Now, by 1940, a lot of them were broken up because they tried overthrowing the United States. And they made a membership, not a membership, they made a partnership with a bunch of other right-wing crazy groups. And 1940, they literally tried to overthrow the United States. And that's pretty much how they're broken up. They had strong residents right here in Long Island, through their Boone meetings in Yaphank to their protests in Franklin Square because they got their office taken away. So we always had a lot of extreme right on Long Island. This is not something new. 1 in 7 people at one time at its peak were Klan members on Long Island. People actually forget that statistic. That kind of is forgotten. And I invite everyone, if they ever get a spare moment, to go to the Suffolk County Historical Society and check out the Klan box that has all the memberships of Klan members and all the other paraphernalia of paid receipts, media, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to know where the other half of that file is to get the other part of that membership, you can go to the Wagner files on Linden Boulevard in Queens Central Library to get that other component that's missing. And, you know, you can break it down yourself with the math. It's 1 in 7 people estimated that were active in the Klan in Long Island at one time. So that being said, when people say, wow, Long Island being conservative, did that come out of nowhere? No, it's always been here. So, you know, we always had a history of extreme right in Long Island, from the Christian Front to the German American Bund to the KKK to the exorbitant amount of slavery on Long Island as well during the times of slavery.
So the obvious question is what are there biographical connections between folks from that era and the people doing the pretty intense anti-mask demonstrations? In Riverhead, we had one in front of the hospital. They've been around other places. I mean, there's a whole network of organizations that are at the fairly far onto the edge of right-wing politics in terms of contemporary issues, conspiracy theories, and all the rest of it. And I just wonder whether this is just coincidental, or whether if you went back and looked at who the leadership is of these various groups, can you find ties to these earlier movements?
So, yeah, you can. You're not going to find a single bullet, you know, like someone that's the guy that connects everything together from 1920 to recent times. I'm going to argue something different. And this is a hypothesis. Once again. I believe it becomes so embedded in Long Island's culture that they forgot. It just became so embedded in the culture of Long Island. If you got 1 out of 7 people that are Klan members, let me give you an example. Paul Linder. Paul Lindor built Malvern. He was a Klan member. He was actually a leader in the Klan. He built Malvern. He built the credit unions for Malvern and Limbrook. So those are the people that give mortgages. So essentially, Long Island became socially engineered by these people, the people I'm referring to. So it became embedded in the culture. destroying a culture is easy, but like changing a culture is tough. And that's where we're at right now. So many people don't even know why these movements, these right-wing movements are coming from. They don't know where these anti-government things are. They pro-small government. They don't know where it came from. They think it's something new, but it's so ingrained, we kind of forgot where it came from. That's my argument.
Mm.
Of course, a lot of these right-wing groups did collaborate together, like the Christian Front, the German American Bund, and these other crazy anti-Semitic, racist, and pro-fascist groups. Yeah, they did connect, but why did they thrive so well here? That's what we should be asking ourselves. And they thrived at the time because of a culture that was created. So my argument is, how do you change the culture? That's what we should be looking at. But once again, this is just a theory. So I'm a historian. I love to say I know everything on things, but I don't. I'm a big fan of The Fifth Discipline by it's like a book about how you build company culture. Like, can it be the same for like community culture? They argue that a culture can be built, and once it's built, it's hard to change it. So can it be the same for a community such as Suffolk and Nassau County? So that's where I'm getting my base from, that, because I have no other answer on that. I will say the Mercer family does give a lot of money to a lot of right-wing groups, and they are from Long Island or live on Long Island. So, and once again, we got the Proud Boys marching in Rockville Center and Bayshore. I live in Bayshore. This is definitely not Proud Boy friendly area, but they feel emboldened to march. So, what brings them out of the woodwork? I don't know. But I'm going to say it's a culture. I wish I could say something more positive, but sorry.
And also, just let me say, there was these pieces about the anniversary of Pearl Harbor just a few days ago. And it's always been my feeling that if there wouldn't have been a Pearl Harbor, if there wouldn't have been an attack, the United States would not have gotten involved in what became World War II. And we all wouldn't, well, certainly I wouldn't be around these days if the Nazis, this country has always had a very, conservative is too nice a word. Reactionary isn't even descriptive enough. Kind of political, from the know-nothings to the slaveholders to, it just goes, it's gone on and on and on.
Yeah, I would say extreme far right, I guess. But we always had that element, and Carl's right. Actually, that's the next project I'm kind of exploring. The Christian Front, man, they had a lot of support, which is pretty freaking scary. So it's extremely scary. And they were arming themselves. They were playing with their guns in their gun clubs, and they were not really gun clubs. They were training camps. That's what they were. So, but yeah, once again, what is the culture here that breeds, well, everywhere kind of, but especially here in Long Island, which is part of New York, and obviously we think of progressivism, which is not so. Let's put it that way. And even when we talk about the civil rights movement, we still have so many challenges to this day. Like Long Island, according to the 2010 census, and I go off the 2010 because the 2020 census we're still trying to figure out, it's like ranks number 11 on most segregated places in America. So, you still see relics of these right-wing movements, like they literally socially engineered, I will argue, from the KKK to the people after leaving the KKK having banks, and to the socially engineering of our friend Robert Moses, So, it has its tentacles in many places. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not rambling. Am I answering your question, John? I apologize.
Oh, you're opening up more questions. I remember the first time I got a feel for that was when Tim Bishop was attacked by the Tea Party. And I went to it was at a school a little up island from Riverhead, I forget where. And I had worked in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And I went to that event and I said, I know these people. I've seen these people before. They were in Mississippi. It had that, and again, as what I was referring to on the kind of intensity. I mean, political differences are political differences, and that's fine. People can have them, but there is a kind of, I think you're right, a cultural intensity that is a little bit surprising, because you think of Long Island in the same context as you think of New York, and are sort of surprised that not too far beneath the surface there is another stream of opinion and life and culture that really is the antithesis of what you kind of assume the Northeast in general is.
Yeah, it's interesting, and disturbing. Actually, I'm gonna go with disturbing, not so much interesting.
Yeah, no, I still come back to the initial, I mean, you may have pinpointed it on the Mercers, but the initial question of where, if you drew a line between the heavy investment during the Second World War and post-war period of the military industrial complexes, on which you also don't think of as, you think of that as a more West Coast phenomena than Long Island. But I think you've in this presentation lifted up a whole side of Long Island that I had not been very aware of. So,
Oh, thank you. So,
doesn't make me comfortable, but it's
it's good to be aware. So it's good to have awareness. No, as Carl said before, I did a book on civil rights in Long Island, and I wrote
I'm fascinated by that. Yeah.
That's a pretty big topic for me. And my master's thesis, it was kind of shortened to 2 pages that got published, but it was a learning curve on how I learned to write. I learned to write relatively well in my master's. It was pretty much how the richest families on Long Island got their wealth from slavery. And, obviously I dive into the most obvious family, the Gardner family, and the Thompson family. And then I find out all these rich families that I mentioned there happen to be related to each other at some point. So, but so it's interesting.
And also, one shouldn't be, like, I'm just reading from page 36 in the book. While many communities across Long Island were fighting integration, and we're talking here about Levittown, and so one developer, Thomas Romano, was trying to embrace the guiding idea that, quote, all men are created equal. Purchased 147 acres of land in North Amityville, Romano built over 1,000 homes. The marketing of these homes was advertised as resisting the undemocratic restrictions of race, color, creed. This development became known as Roanoke Park. For many Black soldiers who were turned away from development such as Levittown, this community became not only a vestige for civil rights principles, but a path to the American middle-class family. So here's a guy named Romano in Suffolk County, in Amityville, North Amityville, decades and decades ago, who did the right thing. And he did it on a large scale. There's this dark side, and it's a very dark side, but still here, and I think everywhere in this country and around the world, there's the other side. It's the side of light and the side of life. One shouldn't become depressed or there's still reason for optimism as opposed to pessimism, and certainly inaction.
Now there is a lot of this. There's definitely a lot of reason to be optimistic still. And as Carl was reading this, I had to pull up the actual advertisement. This is the advertisement. I put this in one of my PowerPoints. I had to pull it up. We proudly present America in 1960 and no un-American, undemocratic restrictions on race, color, and creed, with the dedication and proposal that all men are created equal. $6,990. Wow, we definitely had inflation since 1960, but this is right here, a developer that did the right thing. And, you know, when a lot of banks were turning him away, he kept going to find a bank that would process the VA loans. And he did. He eventually found one. I will say, though, everyone's about what's up with a flat roof. He was trying to do the California Hollywood bungalow look for a lot of these houses. There's very few left that have the flat roof because everyone wanted the Cape style. So on Albany Avenue, I think you have 3 left, I think. But yeah, this is one of the first styles. But yeah, we did have people that did do the right thing. Thomas Romano is one of them. So there's definitely hope. So
And just let me, if I could add, just a personal experience. I mean, I've taught, besides being a journalist, I'm a journalism professor, and I teach at the State University of New York at Old Westbury. And the vision at Old Westbury for, well, this goes back to 1970, over 50 years, is to have a student body which is about 30% African-American, about 30% white, 30% Latino. Originally, it was 10% Asian American and foreign and Native American. That's changed a bit. It's expanded a bit with Asian American, but basically this notion of, it was called back then 30-30-30-10, and it's not on the basis of exclusivity, it's inclusivity. And the faculty is about the same thing, the same basis, and so is the administration. And it's just utterly amazing to me. There'll be some kids from Wyandanch, one of the ghettos in Suffolk County, African-American ghettos, and be a couple of kids from Brentwood, and a student from Flushing, the Chinese-American student, and a couple of doctors' wives from Great Neck. And maybe in the first week, you know, the Latino kids will sit with the other Latino kids in the black. By the second week, they're all mixing. And in a matter of weeks, they've gotten to know each other. And there is learning, which involves centrally diversity as part of the educational experience. And I'm telling you, it works. It really works. You can, integration can work. The dream can work. But you need to kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say structure it, but you have to create these opportunities for people to know each other. We're jumping back to the nightmare of nuclear war and nuclear technology, and it's 2 sides of the same coin, for people to understand, to be aware. And I think through awareness, that corny story, how I got into journalism is I was an intern through Antioch College, and there was a newspaper they put me at Cleveland. It was as corny as can be. And above the entrance was the motto of the paper: give the people the light and they'll find their own way. And I think people will find their own way. Not all the people, but a good majority of people will find their own way if made aware. So that's why I'm in journalism, in education as well. There's great hope. And most people, as I say, will do the right thing. But they have to learn about some of these things we've discussed in this webinar. And a lot of these things haven't been known, and a lot of things are not known. And that has to be challenged.
yeah, and I would always debate historical awareness is key. That's like the underlying theme. Well, I'm subjective. I'm a historian, so. But you know, you also got to look at the change in demographics that we have right now. You know, the last 2 generations, millennial and the Y generation, I think, they're more diverse. They're the most diverse generations we had in American history. You have more interracial kids. You got more people of color in those generations as well. Like, let me give you an example. My wife is Black. My kids are biracial, and 1968. There was states in America that was a no-no. So, it was the Loving case, the Mildred Loving case, Richard and Mildred Loving case, that actually made that got rid of laws against interracial marriages. So, to change a culture does take time. And I think we will be at that tipping point eventually, locally and nationally speaking. There's only so much you can do on holding that back. So, the statistics are against the majority at this moment, that, or the minority that are against it, or whatever it may be. But, the culture will change. Just statistically speaking, it's going to change. So, and, 1968 wasn't that far long ago. That's another thing to think about. So, like, I wouldn't be able to live in Virginia in 1968. I would have been banished or arrested or both. So, and that's not too far long ago at all. So
I'd like to thank Christopher Verga and Karl Grossman for this absolutely fantastic presentation this evening. A lot of ground were covered, and there's a lot still to be learned from the history of Long Island's past. And I hope everybody gets a chance to check out Cold War Long Island. It's available in bookstores, but it's also in some of our local libraries, including East Hampton, for checkout. I'd like to thank everybody for zooming in and who participated. And I think in closing, we may have, let's see, do we have a question in there? We have just some very good comments. Thanks again, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening and week ahead. And we look forward to more webinars.
excellent. Thank you. And thanks for inviting us. This was great. Definitely appreciated the lively discussion.
Thank you. We'll see you again.
John, I will be shooting an email, okay?
Great. All right. Thank you very much. And Karl, thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
sending me the information about the book. So,
Thanks again, guys.
yeah, I'm just not sure if I'm able to copy all of it. That's the problem.
I'll be shooting an email to you.
Okay.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.